Hi, I'm Erin. I'm APMP's content manager, and you're watching On the Record with APMP. Today, I'm joined by Lisa Diven. It's so nice to have you here, Lisa.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to be talking about presentations. Now, presentations are so common in a professional environment, but quite often you can get a slightly, for want of a better word, boring presentation. How do you see a good presentation as differentiated from a boring presentation?
Yeah, so we've all sat through those presentations that were long and boring, and we really wish we were just about anywhere else. Some people describe it as death by PowerPoint, which is a great term that I think a lot of us are familiar with. And so I have a passion for creating presentations that are engaging, and there's a lot of different ways that your presenters can deliver presentations that are way more engaging by focusing on things like storytelling. Things like storytelling really are more impactful because they can evoke emotion. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about presentations, when you're talking about your APMP audience, what we're talking about is a client presentation that often either comes before you get the RFP or it's an interview after the RFP. And so what we like to talk about is think more about what you want that client or your audience, what do you want them to do, and how are you going to make them feel that's going to make them do that, right? So humans make decisions based on emotions. I work in an engineering world. I'm actually an engineer by degree. And even scientists and engineers who will say all their decisions are data-driven make decisions based on emotion. So the more that you can involve storytelling, the more that you can make sure that you're staying very centered around your message, the more impactful your presentations can be.
Great. Well, you mentioned death by PowerPoint, which I love, but what would you say in a typical presentation is like the cardinal sin that tips over into like death by PowerPoint?
Well, I mean, the real obvious one is that, I work with engineers. They like a lot of words on the slides. And I think that most of your audience will know, like, that's not a way to deliver a PowerPoint. However, my engineers tend to push back on me for a few reasons. And so I end up in this conversation with them. The first thing they'll say is, what if I forget what to say? And so I talk to them about, well, there's a lot of different techniques. First of all, please don't read your slides, because that is absolutely the worst thing. That is death by PowerPoint, is when someone has words on a slide and then they read them to you. Because if everything you need to know is on the slide, what do they need the presenter for, right? So let's talk about how you can condense that maybe to some concise bullet points if you need reminders, or using note cards or using speaker notes. But I often say that the most engaging presentations are the kind of presentation deck that without a speaker are absolutely useless, right? The presentation is there, the slides that a lot of us spend a lot of time meticulously working over, they are not the message. The message is what is delivered by your presenter. The slides are there to support that. And so a lot of times I like to talk about just the whole method of putting together a presentation. We often do that backwards. So often I get a call from someone who says, please pull the old PowerPoint deck I used last week, and let's start building our presentation for next week. And that is absolutely the wrong way to do it. You need to start with, what is it you're trying to say? What message are you trying to deliver? And then build from that. How can you incorporate storytelling? What are you gonna do to make your audience feel something? Then who are the right presenters to deliver that message? And once you have that whole outline put together, only then should you start on your slides, because you've got to determine what you want to say, what you're trying to deliver before you actually start building visuals that will help just support that.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because we always talk about PowerPoints as, visual aids, but I feel far too often we're not using them as aids to what we're talking about. We're using them as, the entire focal point. And it's really interesting that you say that we're doing that backwards.
Yep. A lot of times we're letting slides that you have, that exist, that your company already has in their database, using those to drive the message you should deliver. When any of us would know, if we start a proposal, the first thing you do is think about, what message am I trying to say here? And then you outline that, then you craft content to support that. Same thing with a presentation, right? You want to start with, what am I trying to do here? What am I trying to get my audience to do or feel? And then build the content that's supporting that message.
Okay, so when you're starting at that first step of what do I want them to think or feel, do you have any strategies of how you can get to the root of that?
Yeah, so one of the best things, couple things. One, it's just like what we talk about in proposals, which is why I think this topic is so relevant. It's got to be client-centric, customer-centric, audience-centric. So first you have to understand who they are, where their pain points are. It's all the same things that we talk about when we write a proposal, right? And then what you need to think about is, what are you trying to get them to do? And how are you going to move them to do that? I think a lot of times it helps, with a presentation as proposal managers when we get involved. It's usually you're at some point in the sales cycle. So understanding like what do you want them to do might mean I want them to give me the RFP, or I want to be on their short list, or I want them to award me the work. And that's very basic. And so you got to get beyond that. How am I going to get them to do that? And oftentimes you're going to get them to do that by having them understand what makes your company different. And a lot of times you can do that through storytelling, believe it or not.
Okay, and let's touch on storytelling then. How do we turn those insights into stories?
Right, and sometimes that can feel tricky, right? So one of the things I use as an example on how to turn insights into stories is, for us, being in an engineering industry, we use project examples all the time, right? We talk about the importance of having proof that you've done it and you've done it successfully. But we have a bad habit of putting together a slide that has a project photo, and then it has stats about the project. How many cubic yards of concrete did it have? How many linear feet of pipe did it have? And that checks the box that tells your customer, okay, I've done this before. I know your kind of work, but it doesn't tell them why it was successful. And so I've encouraged our teams to tell those project examples more like a story. Okay. How can you tell them, how did the relationship start with that client? Where did we begin? What was their big problem that we ultimately solved? How was the solution that we provided better? And how did it come about? And so think about telling it, what was the story? How did that project unroll? And how did the solution in the end make a difference? And so you think about it at that, especially when you're talking to your technical experts, they get really excited about sharing the great work that they did. Yeah. And so if you can think about that as a story instead of just like a resume, like, hey, check the box, we did this kind of work in the past, can really unlock a lot of storytelling, a lot of emotionally evoked stories within your presentation while still checking the boxes that says, yes, I've done your kind of work before, we understand your business.
Well, it's interesting because with a lot of things at work, if you tell your family or your friends what you did at work that day or a big project that you achieved, you will tell it like a story. But for some reason, when it's a client in front of you, you're just like, data.
Right. Yeah. I think another great example of how to use storytelling is we talk a lot about how important it is to select the right presenters.
Right, okay.
So I think often as a proposal manager, I get pulled in and someone says, we have a client meeting and these people are attending. Mm-hmm. Without a thought as to why those people are attending. Okay. We get a slide deck and we say, Joe, you're going to do slides 2 through 5, and Caitlin, you're going to do 12 through 13, and oh shoot, Greg doesn't have anything to say, so we're going to assign him slide number 9. Again, you're bringing those presenters in the room for a reason. Mm-hmm. So think through your messaging and who is best within your organization to deliver that message. That should be your presenter. Okay. And then I like to sit down one-on-one with each person participating in a presentation, because oftentimes for us, it's a multi-person, it's a team interview, if you will. And I'll sit with them and I'll ask them the question or the topic they're expected to talk about. But I'll ask them specifically, why are you passionate about it? Why do you think our company does that differently? And have them tell their personal story about what they think that we do that is different. And that often unlocks sort of the magic that they're bringing to the meeting. Because if I just give them slides and tell them what to say, I may as well have presented them myself. So you're losing the extra thing, the reason why you invited them in. So encouraging each presenter to tell us a personal story does a lot of things to really make your presentation more impactful.
Yeah, and I suppose with presentations, making them memorable is particularly important because it's a very in-the-moment thing. It's not like a document that you could potentially read later. It's very in the moment. So how do you make sure your presentation is memorable in that way?
Right, so a big piece of that is the storytelling. Mm-hmm. There's a quote I'm gonna get wrong, but it's something like, people don't remember what you say, they remember how you made them feel. Yeah. So if I get up there and we are able to tell stories about how we executed successful projects for our clients, and that builds trust, and it shows how our clients trust us, and the client walks away feeling like we're trustworthy, then that's what they remember, is the feeling that, okay, we can trust this company. They're not gonna remember how many employees we had, but that doesn't really matter. So it's the storytelling is what's memorable. I mean, there's stories when you hear someone tell a story that you'll remember years later because it invokes emotion. So it all kind of centers around that storytelling, evoking emotion, and that's what makes it memorable.
And if you think about it like that the storytelling and obviously having the personal anecdotes will feed into that as well, because you remember people more than you remember a lot of other things.
And if someone's telling a personal story, then their emotion gets into it. Yes. And you can really feel that when they really mean it, right? Because it's coming from the heart. Absolutely.
And then if you're doing it that way, then really the slides are the least important part of the presentation.
Exactly. And I want you touched on something a minute ago that I wanted to circle back to too, is you said, the slides, as a leave behind, or the slides having everything that you wanted to share or leave behind with your audience. Slides are not handouts. The best presentations I've seen are the ones where the slide deck is useless without the presenter. And there's ways you can make great handouts and leave behinds that can supplement that for your audience. But you should never think about your slides as the handout, as the leave behind, because they're not the same thing and they shouldn't be.
Okay. So these slides, how do you make good slides that don't distract from what you're saying, but do supplement your presentation in a way that's impactful?
Right. And so that kind of goes back to understanding your presenters. So every presenter is going to have a different level of comfort. My personal style is I love image-rich slides that honestly sometimes just have a picture. And I talk to the picture, and the picture helps support whatever emotion, whatever feeling I'm trying to evoke when I'm telling that particular story. And so that's my personal style. I have engineers that I coach at my company that would absolutely drive them bonkers, and they could never do it, and it would make them feel insecure. So you don't want to put them in that position. But I think the style of slides really depends on the person, depends on the message you're trying to deliver. A couple of things that I try to remind people when it comes to slide design is really don't let your slides drive the message, let the message drive the slides. One of the questions that often gets asked when I'm in a meeting and we're preparing for a presentation is, how many slides should we have, right? And people have different rules of thumb for how many slides you should have. And my answer to that question is absolutely don't ask that question, because it doesn't matter. I once saw an amazing, engaging presentation that a woman gave, and she went through slides like you wouldn't believe, and in 45 minutes, she had 283 slides. But it was honestly one of the best presentations I've ever seen. And I would also argue that you can give a great presentation with 5 slides. So it just really goes back to don't let your slides dictate your presentation. Don't let the slides boss you around. Slide count really is irrelevant. It depends on how you use the slides.
And I like what you said there about tailoring it to the individual presenter, because no presentation is going to be good if you're pushing someone too far out of their comfort zone.
That is 100% correct. You have to understand where someone is in their comfort level with presenting. So I myself, I'm kind of a weirdo. I love presenting. I love speaking in front of people, so that doesn't make me anxious, and I feel more comfortable not speaking directly to the slide. But I'm not going to take an engineer who's just starting that journey to get a little bit better and a little bit practiced. They're not going to be there yet, and that's okay. So you got to work with people where they are and then try to help shift them in the right direction.
And if you've got a team where you're doing this team presentation and there's a number of different delivery styles among that team, is it okay to make use of all of those different styles?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I think that there's an advantage, especially when you have a long presentation, to having different styles pop up, right? And I don't mean like use different fonts. Obviously, like keep your brand standards. There's something to be said for consistency, building trust. But having different presenters have different styles of slides can actually change up the pace a little bit and help break up what could be a very long day, a monotonous presentation. So I think that's absolutely a good idea.
Great. And do you have any tips for the actual delivery, like verbal delivery?
Verbal delivery, again, it kind of depends on each individual. I know that a lot of people get hung up on non-words. I realize I just said the word right? And so I've had presentation coaches who that's where they hone in, is how many times did you say do you use your hands too much? Do you use your hands not enough? And then I heard one presentation coach say something that's always stuck with me. He said, you want connection, not perfection. So if you're overthinking what you're doing with your hands, all of a sudden, I have never been more aware of my hands than I am in this moment. And then you've totally lost the natural strengths that your speaker has. And so I think that as long as they're connecting with the audience, there's not one way to give presentations.
Absolutely. I mean, when you're having a one-on-one conversation with someone, you're not overthinking where your hands are.
Right. You don't want to be.
Yeah.
Right? Right?
Yeah, you're just connecting with them in the moment, and that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So if I've never given a presentation before and I'm terrified about speaking in front of 100 people, what would you
So the best thing you can do is practice. And I think that's something that, the more you practice, the more comfortable. You're never going to always, I don't know that it's realistic to tell people like someday you'll be like me and just not worry about it. I think I'm missing that gene that most people have that says you should be anxious giving a presentation. But the more you practice, the closer you'll get to comfortable. You may not ever be completely comfortable on stage, but I think that the more you practice, and I think something that people take for granted is when I say practice, I mean practice out loud. Even if you are by yourself in a conference room, I have given more presentations in my car driving to work than probably anywhere else. I have been known to stand in a corner in the hallway of a convention center to present to the wall before I go on. And saying it out loud, people probably think I'm nuts, but talking out loud and practicing is absolutely different than just running through it in your head. And so more repetition will absolutely get you more comfortable. The other thing you have to do is do it in front of someone else. If you're really worried about your own style and you're open to feedback, have someone come in the room with you and just listen and let you know what they think. And you can get a lot out of that. You can also record yourself if you want to see what you look like, because I think a lot of people come across different than what they think they do in their heads. And so there's lots of tools out there. You can do it on your computer, you can do it with your phone. Take a recording of yourself and see how you come across.
Amazing. And to circle back to something you said earlier, you were talking about handouts. What makes an effective after presentation handout?
Yeah, I think the key to handouts is just recognizing your slides are not the handouts, because that frees you from trying to shove every piece of content onto the slide, right? You can move that down into the notes section. I love that PowerPoint actually has a pretty simple function to use the notes page like a handout. You can actually edit and manipulate that just the way you can in Word. I don't think a lot of people realize that. And so I take my PowerPoint, and I use PowerPoint. I'm not as familiar with other platforms. But for PowerPoint, I take the notes section. I can create a notes master that has the title of my presentation, has my contact information, has my logo, has whatever I want. In the master, I can change the size of the slide view that's on the handout, and then you can add the notes, you can format the notes, you can use your brand styles, you can do all kinds of stuff with the handouts right there in PowerPoint, so you don't have to create a separate deliverable, but you don't have to keep all the words on your slides either.
So for our APMP viewers at home, why is this conversation and presentations in general so important for them?
So I think as proposal managers, we are often brought in to help support presentations that are going to be delivered by others. So these are those client presentations trying to land that RFP, and then those follow-up interviews. But we're not often the ones that are out in front of our clients. But I also think that a lot of times people just toss us slide decks and think we're slide designers, and please, can you make this look pretty? I don't know how many times I get a slide deck with no context, and it's just like, I know you're good at PowerPoint, clean this up for me. And I feel like that's a trap that a lot of proposal managers will find themselves in. And I think we need to challenge ourselves and our teams to allow us to be more presentation strategists than just slide designers, the same way we're proposal strategists. Our teams, our proposal managers are the ones that know how to win. We're the ones that know what that messaging needs to be, what those win themes are. We know the things that we need to do to differentiate ourselves when we're trying to sell. And so why not lean into that when it comes to the presentation process? And that's why I think we need to be involved in the very beginning, far before we get the slide deck, but far before you open PowerPoint, we ought to be talking to the teams about what the strategy is.
And if you could give one key takeaway for our aspiring presenters out there, what would it be?
Don't start with the slide deck.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lisa. It was great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
You will notice in front of you, you've got a golden microphone. This is branded with our On the Record with APMP, and that is a keepsake for you to take home as a thanks for being one of our first guests on our new series.
Awesome. That's adorable. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.